Hello, my name is Tom Goddard. I'm the founder and CEO of Integral Healthcare Solutions, and I'm delighted to have you join us today for our monthly webinar. This is the first of a two-part series on telehealth. Seems like the pandemic is inspiring us all, and I couldn't be more delighted to have as our special guest my longtime friend, about, I don't know, 27 years of friendship, Garry Carneal, who's the former president of URAC and currently is the president and CEO of Schooner Strategies, and also, I didn't put on this opening slide, of president of and CEO of RadSite. Welcome, Garry.
Well, thank you. I'm excited to be here and talk a little bit about telemedicine and telehealth.
Me too. Me too. I'm calling in from, or I'm reporting in from my company's offices in dry Tucson, Arizona. And Garry, you are? Why don't you tell our audience where you are?
I'm in hot and steamy Annapolis, Maryland, overlooking the harbor, but it's been very hot and humid. So I don't know who's hotter, you or me.
Hot and dry here, but we're about to get the humidity. It's almost rainy season here. So today we're going to talk about first an overview of the webinar series. We do this webinar once a month, and this is the first of two parts. Garry is going to give us kind of the long history of telehealth accreditation and his personal experience along the way, both inside and outside of URAC. And then next month, Dr. Sean Griffin, the president of URAC, is going to join us to talk about the latest in URAC telehealth accreditation and other related topics. We're very excited and thrilled to have these two superstars of this world joining us this month and next. Just a couple of administrative notes. Toward the, first of all, you'll see at the bottom of your screen an opportunity to ask questions. And so we invite you to ask questions as they occur to you, and we'll take up your questions throughout the webinar today. Toward the end, we'll post a series of poll questions. These poll questions are designed to make these webinars better and find out more about you, our viewers. So I encourage you to participate in that to the fullest extent that it makes sense to. So again, thank you for joining us, and let me share my screen again and dive fully into this conversation. Let's see here. So we already covered who we are. After that, so Garry, I think one of the things that you can, with your a long history of accreditation experience going back to the mid-90s when you joined as URAC's president, talk to us a bit about your legacy there and what you learned along the way that kind of teed you up for this conversation.
Thanks, Tom. You know, it's been interesting as I look back in my career now, approaching, I guess, almost 25 years in the accreditation space, the first 9 years with URAC. You know, I have obviously a great appreciation or perhaps bias in terms of what accreditation does, and particularly in the healthcare space, having brought to market over 20 different accreditation programs since my start at URAC. And I think for those who are involved in the kind of accreditation experience, who are being accredited, you kind of get caught up into kind of the micro elements of accreditation. But what I want to do in this slide is kind of focus on kind of the macro and really how accreditation is a supplement to regulations and other activities really to promote system change within the healthcare space. And perhaps one of the best examples of that is the very first accreditation program that I inherited when I started URAC in 1996, and that was the network, health network standards. And just to give a little bit of a context, obviously we had been used to indemnity insurance in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and then starting the 80s, particularly health maintenance organizations or closed panel networks came on the scene. And then in the early 1990s to mid-1990s, PPOs, or what we used to call point of service plans, really began to take off. And regulation had really not kept up with those changes. So it was really URAC that was kind of first to the table to develop comprehensive standards, and through some strategic alliances was off and running. And the reality is that when you looked at those early standards, they really were kind of ground setting. In fact, I worked with Tom and some of his colleagues integral to really develop credentialing standards that were kind of modified for PPO plans. So that's an example where really URAC got ahead of the rest of the industry, developed standards, and then the other accreditation bodies and regulation followed. You know, another example is URAC obviously got to start doing utilization review and utilization management regulation. But by the time we hit the late 1990s, things had began to really change a little bit, and case management or care management really took off. And that's a good example where URAC proactively worked with the Case Management Society of America and other stakeholders to really kind of expand the framework of care coordination beyond just a review and decision. And that also kind of transcended, existing regulations where there was enabling legislation for utilization review, and case management was much more dynamic. And then, for example, currently, I do run another accreditation program called RadSite, and we're about to launch in the next month or two a new accreditation program for cone beam CT. You may not have heard of that, but over time, your dentist's office, your oral surgeon is going to be using cone beam CT systems instead of X-rays. When you go to the orthopedics and you have a knee injury and you want to put weight on it, they're going to be using a cone beam CT system and not an X-ray. And so that's really a new technology that really up until now has not had any kind of national standards. So for example, we're deep in the weeds of developing physics standards to make sure those machines across different types of manufacturers run consistently. So this is all kind of a segue into, which we're going to get into a little more detail, telemedicine, Tom. So again, accreditation, I think, is a perfect venue, including what URAC is doing now in terms of really helping set the typology for telemedicine.
Gary, on behalf of millions of people, I want to thank you in advance for whatever you have to do with the advance of cone beam CT accreditation. If I don't have to put those little things in my gums, every 6 months to get
it just as a quick sidebar, you get a 3D image. You don't really get any more ionizing radiation. It has much more diagnostic fidelity. So if you're doing oral surgery, or if you do have, if you're getting a knee replacement, don't you want to know kind of what your knee looks like when you're actually standing on it, versus like a traditional CT where you're lying down. So that actually, by the way, is a quick aside, it's the longest accreditation cycle. We've been developing standards now for cone beam CT for 2.5 years. That breaks the record.
Nicely done. Sounds like how long it took for me to get my PhD. I broke all sorts of records in that slow crawl to the end. So let's move forward into the world of telemedicine and telehealth. You are as expert as anybody on the planet to help us go into that, particularly in the domain of accreditation and how that relates.
Well, it's funny because actually, although we hear a lot about telemedicine and telehealth today, obviously in part because of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's been around, or the concept, a long time. And, we hear about people talking about it when the telephone's invented with Graham Bell. We have back in 1948, two kind of radiologists, or early stage radiologists, sharing an image over 25 miles in the state of Pennsylvania through digital means. Then you have University of Nebraska transmitting a neurological exam in 1959, kind of almost like in a real-time video consult. And then you have, for example, NASA developing, kind of bio measures through the space program, Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. So the kind of brewings of telemedicine and telehealth have been around in many shapes and forms. And in fact, URAC really got into the telemedicine and telehealth space back in the late 1990s. And one of the first accreditation programs that we developed during my tenure was what we originally called 24 nurse triage and health information standards. And what had been happening is that many managed care organizations have been using nurse triage and other entities to basically allow the consumer or patient to call in and basically triage their symptoms instead of showing up in the emergency room. So that kind of gave us the idea to develop these 24-hour nurse triage standards. And then we later kind of updated them and called them the health call center standards. So that was really kind of an important contribution because it was a exchange between a provider, typically a licensed nurse, and a patient through the telephone, following clinical pathways like under Schmidt-Thompson criteria. And really, URAC was first at the table to kind of develop the accreditation programs. Almost immediately after that, as I mentioned before, URAC developed case management standards. And unlike utilization management, which is more an administrative decision as to what's medically necessary and appropriate, case management really is care coordination. So again, you have a licensed nurse typically or other licensed professional providing coordinating care. And one great example is that if you're a chronically ill patient, it's often that case manager that's coordinating your care, your health coach between the continuum of care. So really, URAC got to a very early start. I left URAC in 2005, and I'll let Tom, Dr. Griffin, in the next webinar kind of give an update on what URAC has done, more recently in telemedicine, telehealth. But my re-entree into telehealth was I was hired by the American Telemedicine Association in 2016. They had launched a accreditation program called the Accreditation Program for Online Patient Consultations, which really dealt with a patient or consumer-initiated kind of virtual care situations. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then one thing led to another. They realized that ATA, as being a membership organization, wasn't necessarily the independent organization to do accreditation. So I founded a new group called Clear Health Quality Institute, where eventually we took over the ATA program and expanded upon it in 2018. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then we added kind of an outcomes module a year later in 2019, and been working last year also on remote patient monitoring standards. So, there are, I think for a while, a Joint Commission had a telemedicine telehealth accreditation program. Obviously, URAC has had one. And as Tom will talk about, URAC actually acquired all the assets of CHQI at the beginning of this year. So that body of work has moved over to URAC at this point.
Thank you. So while CHQI was working on its telemedicine programs, URAC also came out with its version 1.0 of telehealth accreditation. And interestingly, for accreditation geeks like the folks in my firm and like you, this was really the first cue or clue that we had as to what URAC was going to do a couple of years later with its core version 4.0. We start to see the change in approach to writing and packaging accreditation programs. Telehealth was really the first of these. And so those of you who have gone through or are going through any of the more modern accreditation programs from the last 2 years, since February of 2018, will recognize some of this new language, the risk management, consumer protection empowerment. These are all terms that we're now becoming familiar with as URAC rolls out its new core standards to all of its programs across the board last year and this year and over the next couple of years, it would be my guess. And then you can see that we get to the telehealth specific modules of professional practice, technology, consumer education, and care coordination, as well as measures reporting. Now, for a variety of reasons, largely, I would say, due to the fact that URAC was actually ahead of the market, ahead of the industry, not an awful lot happened there. I went to our URAC telehealth conference a couple of years ago, and while there was interest in the telehealth world and telehealth program, the dominant takeaway that I came away with in the sessions I attended was that both the federal government and the other payers in the marketplace couldn't quite figure out, come to a conclusion about where they would allow telehealth and for when they would compensate for telehealth. And so without that market driver, URAC, as it often has, was just slightly ahead. To its credit, I would say, slightly ahead of where the industry has been. Very often what URAC, it seems to me, has done is provided a good template for the industry to think about how to develop sound administrative, structural, and process structures for a nascent industry. We've seen this in specialty pharmacy, for example, where URAC's accreditation program has provided essential guidance to the pharmacy industry on how to structure specialty pharmacy, which personally I hadn't heard of until about a dozen years ago. And now it's all, it's most of what we do. And URAC's forward-looking approach to the health industry has, I think, served these these developing segments of the industry well. And also, as often has happened in URAC's life, then there's learning along the way. As I think back to especially Pharmacy 1.0, there was a certain learning curve between that and the last fall's 4.0. There's been a whole bunch of learning that has allowed it to be more flexible, streamlined, the accreditation program, and more reflective of what's actually going on in the industry today. And I think we've seen that, and we'll, as Gary mentioned, we'll learn a whole lot more about the most recent dimensions of that. But I think we learn a lot about URAC's new thinking by looking at what Gary and the CHQI folks have done elsewhere. But before we get to that, I did want to talk, kind of just back and forth. Why do we even care? Why is it even important that telehealth be accredited? Why does accreditation in healthcare matter? So let me toss that back to you, my friend.
And Tom, just to pick up a couple of themes. I mean, one of the wonderful things about accreditation is that it's really a community-based effort. I mean, when you look at URAC and what CHQI did and what ATA did as well, you have typically a standards committee that's made up of volunteers, mostly typically with the subject matter expertise of what you're accrediting, but also other stakeholders. And it really, what happened both, I'm sure, through URAC and ATA is really kind of a vetting of really what is telemedicine, telehealth, and in the next slide, we'll see a little bit more detail in terms of what that means. But, and to your point in terms of versions, I mean, that's why it's really not a static enterprise. In fact, CHQI did 2 versions of the telemedicine program that inherited from ATA. So within 3 years, or basically 3 versions, ATA's, CHQI's 2.0, and then CHQI's 2.1. And I think URAC is already updating that. And, it's interesting because once I was engaged by the ATA and working on this, I did meet with a lot of payer groups. What struck me was really kind of the ambiguity of how payers were absorbing what telemedicine telehealth did. I mean, going back to, for example, the PPO example, the only reason why the PPO accreditation program really took off was because UAW back in 1995, 96 said that they wanted to mandate PPO accreditation, and it kind of got jump-started with the ISO 9000 tradition, but then recognizing URAC in that process. And so it really is important for payers to kind of drive often the purposes of accreditation. And, there's the reality is that, as you said, URAC and ATA were kind of ahead of the market. So there's still a lot of debate as to what the telemedicine telehealth industry represents. A lot of it's early stage. A lot of the companies I found that were going through I must have had contact with over 200 telemedicine programs providers during my 3 or 4 year engagement with ATA and CHQI. And one of my takeaways was that they're often pretty immature businesses, unlike kind of the managed care industry that's been around for decades. But as highlighted by this slide, there's really this cross-fertilization function, the advantages of a third-party assessment. And the bottom line is that in the old days, when I had hair in my head, there was enabling legislation which you could rely on, such as the federal government and all 50 states had regulations for HMOs. The federal government and I think 47, 48 states had and have enabling legislation for utilization management. But as healthcare has become more complex, we really are in a post-regulatory environment. And quite frankly, even the private purchasers or the public organizations that serve as a public purchaser, their ability to get all the details down in RFP is really impossible. So really, for example, URAC's telehealth accreditation program going forward is going to fill that gap, and their communication link with the payers and other stakeholder groups is going to be critical. So not only do you have all the kind of bells and whistles of actually the accredited organization improving its operations through the traditional feedback loops that URAC and others offer, such as the desktop review and providing feedback and the on-site audit, but you also have kind of this movement, this almost public policy benefit and the synergy between all those different forces.
I'm remembering, Gary, when you first hired me 21 plus years ago as COO and General Counsel at URAC. One of the very first things that I undertook, excuse me, I should have turned that off, one of the very first things that I undertook was a survey of our accredited companies, and one of the key questions was why did you seek accreditation? And certainly a lot of companies said yes. The accreditation makes us better. You know, we become a better organization through that, and certainly I've experienced that since my company has become URAC certified. We're a better organization as a result of that. But the top driver, and then some said, well, it helps with regulation, and you know, URAC and other accrediting bodies are recognized by upwards of 36 state sets of state laws and regulations, and you know, several federal agencies like the Defense Department Healthcare Plan, and the Obamacare recognizes accreditation programs. So there's this regulatory driver, but really, in my couple of decades in this world, it's the payers, and if Medicare is not paying attention to it, and if the insurers and other payers are not paying attention to it, or the third party folks, then there's no major driver. And I think one of the things that we can get into in a little more detail is the impact of the pandemic on the federal and private payers stepping up and then driving this, which is why this seems like a pretty timely topic for us to cover.
And by the way,
go ahead.
The private payers are, you know, much more interested than they were 3 or 4 years ago, and that's, you know, highlighted, for example, with kind of CMS reimbursing much more regularly for different forms of telemedicine, telehealth, even before the pandemic struck, and other payers. There was a pretty big initiative by, for example, the National Alliance for Healthcare Person Coalitions to ask some, you know, questions to the major health plans, and so really to you know, better understand the clinical and financial efficacy of telemedicine, telehealth, which I do think is becoming more apparent as, you know, each passing year. But you know, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
You know, one of the interesting things, starting with the American Telemedicine Association, they had this wonderful community of, you know, thousands of members, and really have been kind of the preeminent trade association historically, kind of working with telemedicine. I know they've been around for over 2 decades, and when I first was engaged, they had spent again a lot of time on beginning to develop the model, and this was, we see on your screen, is kind of a typology that started with the ATA and was further you know, expanded through Clear Health Quality Institute, and now is in URAC's lab. Basically, the online patient consultation program was what we call kind of the consumer to provider module, but that only captured, you know, based on this kind of buckets, 1/3 of the landscape for telemedicine, telehealth, and then there are 2 other buckets that I'll describe in a minute. So consumer to provider really gets back to, for example, that URAC nurse triage example, where it's a virtual care of some sort that's initiated by the patient or consumer. And so, for example, if you call, you know, a major nurse or physician consultation group, that would fall under consumer to provider. And you know, in many cases, it's to avoid emergency room admissions, and obviously in today's environment, really to supplement the traditional face-to-face, you know, kind of exam, et cetera. And you can see when we create these buckets, we have these, you know, the general characteristics, the service lines examples. I'll talk a little bit more about that, and kind of the common originating sites. And I should say, it's not necessarily obvious, but the concept originating site describes where the patient or consumer is, who's actually participating in the telemedicine, telehealth exchange. The distance site is where the physician or provider is located. So you got to think about that in terms of, so common originating sites is where the patient is actually, you know, participating in the telemedicine, telehealth consult. Then you have the second bucket of provider to consumer. So that like would cover things like an ongoing mental health counseling relationship that you schedule with your psychologist, case management, where you know, basically a case manager has been assigned to me because I have 3 or 4 comorbidities and they're managing me. And actually, it's amazing, you know, they're doing tele-rehab now virtually, and just kind of all the different types of ongoing kind of provider-based relationships and care, from kind of primary care to specialty care, and even obviously now even some urgent care consults. And then finally, you have the provider to provider bucket, which covers things like teleradiology. So when you know, I'm imaged through cone beam CT, and that's sent to a third-party radiologist to interpret. That's a type of telemedicine transaction. When I'm in the hospital and there's some coordination about avoiding, you know, a relapse with a stroke, or continuity care, telestroke, tele-ICU, you can kind of see, link in other experts around the world. So with these three buckets, you can really see kind of the diversification of telemedicine and telehealth, and why it's a very kind of broad field. And that also includes both synchronous and asynchronous transactions. So synchronous transaction obviously is a concept of it's real time. You're interacting with the provider, you know, through a video chat or phone, etc. And then you have asynchronous, where there's a consult where maybe you're filling out a questionnaire or you're recording something, and then the provider will look at it and then get back to you. Teleradiology is asynchronous typically, because you're getting the exam, the image is being shipped, being interpreted, and then it's the report's being sent back to the treating physician. So that's an important concept. The other thing I will say is that when I first started with the ATA, there was definitely a bias towards physician care. And I think from my perspective, it's important that we should be agnostic. If you're a provider, whether you're a physician, nurse, another type of medical professional, you know, you're a legitimate part of telehealth, telemedicine. And the different types of sponsoring entities, you have everything from, let's say, a complex hospital system that may have multiple telehealth, telemedicine programs within its operations. You may have a health plan that's more targeted, you know, care management, case management, or you may have a specialty telehealth provider that's, you know, promoting a certain type of treatment or drug, you know, medication. So you really have a very broad spectrum of the type of organizations are involved with telemedicine, telehealth, much more traditionally than, let's say, you know, a traditional accreditation program that may be geared towards more of a company type, like a PPO. That's, you know, typically an insurance company. Tom.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Well, let me flip to this. The this slide helps us go a bit deeper into what you did with CHQI and before that with ATA. Can you walk us through some of these essential components of the standards as you see them?
So this is kind of a composite of different accreditation programs and different concepts. And those of us who've gone through accreditation, a lot of these concepts will be familiar, but there are some fun twists. And I think through the standards development process, I ended up being involved with 3 standards committees, you know, in the past couple of years. The Telemedicine Standards Committee that started with the ATA, CHQI, a standards committee that was focused on telemedicine outcomes, and a standards committee that was focused on remote patient monitoring. And so a lot of these are kind of shared concepts, but at the end of the day, you know, in addition to the normal block and tackling of an accreditation protocol, such as running a quality assurance program, there's an additional layer of the virtual care aspect of that, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So, you know, you can move around these categories in the details, but I think this is an illustrative example of many of the standards that would be embedded in, that have been embedded in CHQI's and URAC's accreditation programs, for example. So, you know, we're all familiar with the basic business requirements, which is typically part of the core accreditation. But like one kind of focus on this that is unique is the relationship of the organization-wide, the telemedicine provider organization, and the service lines that they're offering. So part of this is if you have a large telemedicine teleprovider, they may be offering 5 or 6 programs at once. And so a big part of the review process is what is that service program, and you know, what's their capacity? Do they have the right, you know, training for that program? So it's really, is kind of mixing together in the delivery system a lot of different, very specific aspects. And so that does complicate the business requirements in some respects to make it more multidimensional. And just going on to professional requirements and related back to business requirements, the question is really what is the program goals for each of those specific service lines that are embedded within, one of those modules or however else it's expressed. And that gets into detail of things like credentialing and interstate licensure. I mean, clearly, if you're a hospital in Arizona or Maryland, licensure is not necessarily as complicated in face-to-face care, but all of a sudden you're crossing state borders. And for example, on the one hand, for nurses, you have an interstate compact where close to over 2/3 of the states recognize each other's state licensing, but then you have a more conservative approach with the medical boards for physicians. They've actually recognized a expedited licensing process, but you don't have that same kind of recognition of out-of-state licensure. So you have to make sure there's a risk management program that kind of puts that all together, because you really are kind of transcending the state borders pretty regularly. And training, and end user proficiency, which is part technology, you really have to start thinking you're not just training the provider to render care, but for example, if they're using a virtual stethoscope or they're using a remote patient monitoring, making sure that the video link, the communication, the body language, all of that comes into play, so the training is a little bit more complex. And then you have all the issues of the hardware and software, and as you jump over to kind of the risk management issues, the security protocols. So all of that has to kind of be dealt with, and as part of the creation process, you really need kind of a complexity or an extra dimension of the policy and procedures as part of the desktop review, and making sure that information is sought through and that it's shared with the right stakeholders within that telemedicine health provider. And of course, things are changing, relatively quickly. Under quality assurance program, the notion of patient consent. For one of the things that URAC developed under case management was that the patient had to consent to case management. That was a big deal back in the late 1990s. Well, in this case, it's not only consenting to the care, but also consenting to the virtual care. So it's almost like two layers. And how do you do that? Is it informed consent? Is it, active consent? Exactly how's that consent documented? And it may vary, between different types of telemedicine, telehealth programs. And then you have the whole notion of outcomes. If the industry is just coming together and really solidifying kind of basic workflows, policy and procedures, the different process and structures, where does that leave outcomes? Well, pretty early stage. So actually the ATA and CHQI standards had really just the goal for outcomes to start measuring, because everything was a startup. And I'll talk a little bit more about what the telemedicine outcomes module did in a minute. And then you have the issue, the clinical workflow requirements. So you have issues of actually what is the right clinical guideline, for a particular case. Does it change because it's virtual care? What are the new evidence-based pathways that are emerging? What do you do with medication and e-prescribing? For example, for a controlled substance, the DEA, the federal government, doesn't always agree with the states. And we spent a lot of time, CHQI, and I'm sure now URAC, how to navigate how you create that kind of common law standard of e-prescribing, where you literally have regulations that are in conflict with each other. Transitions to care. If I have a urgent telehealth visit with a physician, how does that information get back to my primary care physician? Care coordination. And if I'm transitioning from virtual care back to face-to-face care and back and forth, how's that all kind of linked together? How am I as a patient activated to understand what my role is and what it means for the telemedicine, telehealth transaction? Financial, just to kind of wrap it up, there's the issue of, I've been hearing sometimes the patients are charged two deductibles, one for the care and one for the fact that it's virtual care. And so the financial protocols, the patient billing, provider reimbursements all kind of coming together. So accreditation can help steer that and identify best practices. And then ultimately, what is the patient-provider relationship in virtual care? Well, the bottom line is it really shouldn't be different than face-to-face care, but how do you kind of how do you actually identify that? And also, what's the bare minimum for a patient-provider relationship, particularly as it relates to issuing some medications and making sure that those minimum practice medicine standards are met in the state. So that's just kind of a flavor of the spectrum of different issues. And what was exciting is to see how ATA took it, how CHQI kind of worked on it, and how organizations like URAC will continue kind of fine-tuning these principles as we move forward. And quite frankly, this is where regulation really hasn't been providing many of the answers. Accreditation is really kind of the main game in town, in my opinion, in terms of really providing some of these workflow characteristics of telemedicine to help when you get down to the details to ensure ultimately the optimized clinical outcome for the patient and reasonable, financial returns on these programs.
And Gary, it seems like it has ever been thus, at least in my experience with accreditation. I remember the birth of URAC followed immediately after the states started to regulate utilization and review. It was almost as if the healthcare world saw the limitations of regulation in like 1988, I think, was the first time the state of Maryland, which was kind of ahead of the curve, started regulating utilization and review in a robust way. And almost immediately the industry came together and said, oh my God, we've got to do some accreditation here because regulation has a tendency to be two things that are not particularly conducive to innovation. It tends to, first of all, it tends to be look out the back, the review mirror. So it's looking at what was, not what is and what is emerging. It certainly doesn't have much capacity to see what is emerging. And it's also blunt. It's a blunt instrument that it almost never as refined and subtle as accreditation can be. And I think that's the popularity of it. And that's why so many regulators have said, you folks have this because you all are much more in contact with the vagaries of the industry, the developments in the industry, and the subtleties of how this actually works. It would be inconceivable to get broad-based regulation of telehealth and telemedicine at anywhere near the sophistication of what you're walking us through and what URAC has walked us through, and ATA and CHQI has been doing. So I think what's going to be interesting is, because we've seen this curve happen over and over, haven't we, for almost 30 years now. The regulators kind of stumble into it and go, oh, we don't know how to do this. Accrediting bodies come in, start to be more forward-looking, more refined, and then the regulators say, thank you, and now we acknowledge you. And so what's going to be interesting over the next months and hopefully
and by the way, Tom, just a quick sidebar. So what amazes me is that the Federal HMO Act and the NAIC Model Act, both which were adopted in the early 1970s, did not have utilization management as part of the regulatory schema. So here you have kind of this tighter control of care, and without kind of a structured process to make the medical necessity review determination and potentially appeals process when there's a denial of care. And to your point, in Maryland and Louisiana, they adopted the first state laws in 1988, and then URAC and NCQA were formed in 1989, 1990. And then the NAC caught up. Actually, that's where I met you, right? I was the staff working at the NAC that developed the model law, which I think was adopted in like 1993. But to show you how URAC has continued to stay on the cutting edge, once the kind of accreditation standards and regulations kicked in, then there was concerns about, denials of care in the appeals process. So URAC had worked also starting in the early 1990s with the National Association of Independent Review Organizations, and URAC developed the external review standards about 7 or 8 years before the NAIC developed a model external review law, and about a decade before those requirements were embedded in the Affordable Care Act. So, I do think the telemedicine is a prime example where now URAC is in a position really to continue providing industry leadership as an independent organization on many of these different aspects.
Yeah, and just for our viewers who are not familiar with it, because we have a wide range of viewers of our webinar, the NAIC, where Gary and I met in '93, is the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, and they have, for it seems like a million years, developed model acts, which is just want to make sure that you knew what Gary and I are talking about there. So Gary, let's talk a bit about kind of, and you alluded to this a few minutes ago, the kind of the evolution of accreditation. I mean, when you and I were involved in this together, we were deeply steeped in. This seems like a conversation you and I have had for 20 years now. The accreditation in its strength is an assessment of and standardization of process and structure requirements, but not much more than that historically. Anything else you want to say about that kind of proto or early stages of accreditation, the process structure world?
Well, I think that's obviously, the first step. And going back to our discussion with payers, I mean, at the end of the day, what if you have a kind of a workflow, whether it's peer reviewed by an accreditation organization or not, what's the outcome? Is the patient getting better? Is the population health improving? Is there a return on investment for dollars invested in? What's the savings? And so, probably the best example is NCQA. Was first to market with the health plan or HMO accreditation program, and then a group called the HMO Group, which is a nonprofit group, delivered to them in the early 1990s the first version of HEDIS, which basically are more specific measures, although some would argue those are still process measures, but they have more kind of outcomes framework. So, it's great to have these different programs, but a lot of stakeholders want to engage in that outcomes. And of course, one of the pressure points is that you have a lot of different outcome measures. So sometimes the entity that's subject to those measures feels overwhelmed. And you can see that with the different value-based purchasing criteria coming out of the federal government and some private purchasers. So there's always a concern about trying to standardize and coming up with a common dialogue. And so that's in part why I think the National Quality Forum was formed, to help kind of vet some of those measures in a kind of more society-wide framework.
Yeah, I remember conversations where you and I were both expressing frustration as early as 20 years ago or more, about, process and structure is really only part of the story. What we want to know is, does it work? Which I think has been that one question. Do these processes and structures really actually help consumers or patients be better? And so that's where we've been heading here, and you have done some work over the years on telemedicine in particular, what those outcome standards might look like.
And by the way, one kind of medical management service function that kind of maybe imploding is too strong of a word, because they didn't deal with outcomes sufficiently, was the disease management movement about 15 years ago. And you may recall there's a lot of hype about disease management really before complex condition management took off. And the problems that they weren't, they had the process and structure measures, NCQA, URAC, and others had accreditation programs, but they were missing kind of the fundamentals of statistical analysis for outcomes. So for example, they weren't controlling for regression to the mean. So when the GAO and others did kind of these reports on the, again, clinical and financial efficacy of disease management, are really just kind of folded in by itself, because there really just wasn't any the way that was structured. And that's a discussion for another day. But it's interesting because I was still energized by all this innovation in the telemedicine, telehealth space. A lot of it kind of in the area of process and structure workflows. And then I knew that the first set of standards from ATA and SHQI were pretty soft on what we were requiring in terms of outcomes. And so it became apparent to me the National Quality Forum in 2017 in August had published a report. Now, a lot of times the National Quality Forum will actually publish specific measures that have been validated. In this case, it was about a 2-year effort, and it was really more, and you can download it if you type in National Quality Forum telemedicine outcomes framework. You'll find the publication. There's a page that they have, and it really was a 40-50 page document looking at kind of the state of measurement for outcomes, and really providing almost like an inspirational framework to move forward. And they had focused specifically on 4 domains of measurement: access to care, clinical effectiveness, clinical experience / satisfaction, and financial impact. So they had those kind of 4 buckets, and they talked a little bit about that. And they had a very prestigious panel that helped them put that together. And in CHQI's version 2.0, we had looked at 3 areas. We identified clinical services and patient satisfaction that had overlapped with the NQF domains, but we had a third that really didn't directly overlap, and that was the an operations bucket. So we kind of brought that all together, formed a new committee. I'd say a third of the committee was made up of the NQF committee as well, our panel, and spent about a year developing 5 domains that kind of crosswalk back to both the NQF and current, then accreditation outcomes measure requirements. So we came up with the 5 domains, which basically overlapped access to care, clinical effectiveness, clinical experience satisfaction, patient impact, and operations. And so really, it was kind of a 2-stage process. That was the vision, that a company would go through accreditation, begin doing the measurements, and then come back for the supplement standard, review as a different module once they had a more mature and had a full cycle of, outcomes measurement, and it was integrated into the quality assurance committee, et cetera. So I had developed this and handed it over to, it was handed over to URAC before we actually officially launched the program or had companies accredited. So you have to talk to Dr. Griffin in terms of where this is going forward. But so the standards are there. And I think, again, it was the public policy discussions from the standards committee that talked about this were fascinating in terms of, what do you measure? What are examples of the measures under each of these domains? And really, what is the end of the day, the impact on the industry, the benefit for patients, and hopefully beginning to provide some structure. So this is a journey, right? It's not a hemoglobin globin A1C measure that's kind of mandated, but these are 10, measures under access to care, and you can pick one. And then over time, I imagine that there'll be more standardization of the measures coming from URAC and perhaps the NQF.
Beautiful, beautiful. Now, remote patient monitoring, how is this different than what you've talked about in terms of telehealth and telemedicine already? What is this?
So obviously, remote patient monitoring is another buzzword. There's ambiguity around what it means. There is some diversification in the definitions. We formed another standards committee, spent the better part of a year developing the standards in this. I don't know if it's been launched into a accreditation program, but was able to spend 9-10 months kind of talking about what it meant. So kind of in a nutshell, remote patient monitoring is not the same thing as telemedicine. Remote patient monitoring really focuses on the digital communication link between the provider and patient, often based on patient-generated health data or other types of biophysiological data inputs or psychosocial inputs that are put in one location and transmitted to another location. So it's really viewed as an accessory to telemedicine. It has its own purpose, but by itself, it's not a treatment program. One of the things that, one value judgment we made was that if we were to have moved forward with launching the remote patient monitoring accreditation program, it would have to involve the active participation of a attending provider. So it's not the same thing as using my Fitbit or Apple Watch. That would fall outside of it. And like the other telemedicine standards, there are some really interesting things about where we are in terms of the regulations. So the FDA has developed some regulations pursuant to the Cures Act, and many instances remote patient monitoring would fall into what's called a Class 2 device, which would be kind of moderate risk. But there are still a lot of different types of remote patient monitoring interventions, and it's not always clear how they should be regulated. And I think the FDA has recognized that. And so, one of the challenges with accreditation, one of the opportunities is really to put an additional framework around what the regulations are doing to provide a little bit more specificity. And then, at the end of the day, to ensure, patient safety. There's an old saying: you've seen one remote patient monitoring system, you've seen a remote patient monitoring system. There's so many different nuances in terms of how the platform runs, the security protocols, whether it's being used for clinical assessments, disease monitoring, analysis for trend reporting, et cetera. So, but it's a really good discussion, and I think I would encourage you to ask Dr. Griffin next month what they're planning to do with this, if anything, because it's important. There are some payers that are reimbursing now for remote patient monitoring programs, more so than in the past. And I know that on the standards committee that CHQI had, there were a lot of great remote patient monitoring advocates and a lot of remote patient monitoring device manufacturers that were looking to accreditation to really kind of help, hold them accountable, help them provide that structure, and also to help, kind of promote this service function, however it's described.
As a man reaching Medicare age, I have this question. In addition to what I'm familiar with, which is heart monitoring, my Apple Watch does that for me, and I can see how I'm doing there. What kind of disease states are kind of prime candidates for this digital connection?
Well, it's really, again, the spectrum is very, very dynamic. You can have everything from kind of basic texting systems that provide, send out a questionnaire, how are you feeling, check in with you. Obviously, class 3 devices are something like a pacemaker, right? I mean, that could be a part of a remote patient monitoring device if it's reporting, my rhythm through that pacemaker. But because it's in my heart, that's a high risk device. So you really have this continuum, and really the sky's the limit in terms of what you can monitor. I mean, to your point, my Fitbit, which is not tech, I don't have a provider involved, but I think the most useful thing for me is my sleep patterns. Now, that also begs the question: how accurate is it, right? If I got a sleep score of 70 versus a sleep score of 90, or vice versa, how much is that really tracking my REM sleep, et cetera? So, but I do think that in this age towards technology, many different types of care conditions are being treated by different types of remote patient monitoring devices. A diabetic population, a Bluetooth-enabled weight machine, a blood pressure. And all that gives real-time information back to the attending provider or case manager. So I think we're all familiar with this. And, again, what's interesting is that although a lot of the stuff is to market, the discourse, the diversity of opinions that I found through the standards committee told me it was right for an organization like URAC to continue this work to really kind of provide a leadership position and actually, quite frankly, create a synergistic communication link back to the device manufacturers, the FDA, purchasers, and other stakeholders.
Wonderful. Well, I'm going to weigh in a bit on this. 2020 has been a big year for URAC. As you know, they bought your CHQI's Telemedicine, and other programs as well, including health parity, which we'll talk about sometime this fall in a webinar. And version 2 rolled out shortly thereafter, and you can see that they pretty much took the CHQI structure, C2P, P2C, and P2P, and incorporated that into its own standards really quite quickly. They turned that around right away, and then hard on the heels of that turnaround was July 8th, just a couple of weeks ago, the URAC remote patient monitoring.
Oh, yay! I didn't know that.
Yep,
That's wonderful.
Came out just a couple of weeks ago. Haven't dived into it yet. It's so fresh. It's fresh right out of the oven. And then I'm aware that URAC has been working on a version 3.0. Actually, before it acquired CHQI's standards, it had started a revision of the telehealth accreditation program, but it's still in draft form, and I'm very curious to see how much Dr. Griffin will be able to tell us next month about this. And I'm champing at the bit to see it come out, to see what that mystical marriage between the URAC approach and the CHQI and other approaches, and what URAC's learned through this process will be. So we'll be talking to Dr. Griffin, of course, about that. I think that'll be the main part of the August webinar. First, before we dive into this kind of last wrap up, what I want to talk to our viewers about is we're going to start sending out over the next minute or two. We're going to start sending out poll questions, I really strongly request, as a favor to us and a favor to future webinar participants, particularly on this topic, that you answer the questions for us. We're going to take that information that you provide us and help not only to design better webinars down the road, particularly on this topic, but also design our integral healthcare solutions consulting services to better serve our clients and future clients. So please, we're going to start sending those if we haven't already. As soon as I say the word polling, I think, there we go. They're starting to come out now. And so I ask you to while Gary and I kind of close out these last 5 minutes, start filling those, start answering those questions for us. We're very curious about where you are in the world of telemedicine. So let's close out with these thoughts, Gary. What have we not talked about that seems essential to discuss before we close at the top of the hour?
I mean, clearly we referenced briefly, the impact of COVID-19. So clearly this is accelerating virtual care on many fronts. So this is kind of a reinforcement of kind of trends and perhaps an accelerant. One of the things, there were roughly 7 or 8 accredited companies that came through the ATA, and during the year or so that the CHQA accreditation program was live, maybe another 10 companies came through. And again, I think I mentioned, probably talked to a couple hundred organizations that expressed an interest. And I think one thing I just, kind of was obvious to me was that most of them were on startup mode. So even like say a sophisticated hospital that's been in business for 100 years, and the actual telemedicine telehealth program was kind of a new exercise. So they were dealing with some of the fundamentals that perhaps were worked out, decades ago. And I mentioned before, just the wide range of sponsors. So it really is many different kind of accreditation programs, if you will, kind of wrapped up in this typology. But just the difference in potential workflows from a hospital system to a health plan to a nurse triage company to a call center to standalone telemedicine organization could vary significantly. Whether in just one state or they're nationally, whether they're in fact virtual, and how you deal with that, and just the diversity of services, as I mentioned. I'm on a couple email exchanges, and there's still a lot of, every time, for example, CMS issues a new reimbursement protocol, there's probably 20 to 30 emails trying to explain exactly how that works. And of course, no one wants to violate a Stark law and things like that. So there's still a lot of details as to how the telemedicine services are actually paid for and how that all works. I think regulations are, although the states and the federal government do have telemedicine telehealth regulations, they're inherently limited. They do not reflect the scope and kind of fidelity of now what's URAC standards. So I think the accreditation programs will play as important role as perhaps ever in terms of creating that common law standard, kind of the national standardization that we need, particularly in telehealth, telemedicine, where it really is an interstate kind of exercise of healthcare. I think that there needs to be more discussion on the clinical pathways that perhaps are slightly modified because of the virtual framework, depending on the type, whether it's consumer to provider, provider to consumer, provider to provider, synchronous, asynchronous, the actual digital aspects of it. All these clinical pathways have to be perhaps kind of customized. It's almost like DNA profiling or genetic testing. It's going to be really specific to the circumstance. And a lot of the programs, quite frankly, are struggling with quality. Those that applied took a long time to get through the accreditation process, because they were dealing with all the fundamentals. And then there were a few organizations that just had bad habits and were perhaps skirting, existing medical licensure laws. So that puts more pressure on the accreditation organization to really kind of police it and make sure that that organization is ultimately a best-in-class organization. And of course, last but not least, is that the field is not static. I mean, there's just tremendous innovation, and I think that's why you'll see URAC continue to update its standards in, kind of an ongoing fashion, because the world is changing very quickly. So course, at the end of the day, this represents a significant opportunity for patients to get better care. You know, you can access rural areas, underserved and urban areas. And so the opportunity here is significant and perhaps transformative as to the healthcare system we once knew. And so it's a really exciting time, and I look forward to watching and seeing what URAC does, you know, going forward in the space. And you know, I think, again, as we said, they're in the leadership position to really help deal with some of these issues that regulation really cannot address, or purchasers that are taking a more ad hoc approach to kind of structuring how telemedicine and telehealth programs should work.
And just one final note on my end of things. The what I've I think I'll end the poll now so I can see what's going on here. I read in the news the other day that the House of Representatives either passed or was considering passing law that to make permanent what seemed to be temporary COVID expansion of federal recognition of telehealth and compensation for telehealth. And so I think that's an interesting thing to watch. We'll see if that happens in this Congress or if we need to wait for the next Congress. They may wait until the COVID crisis is over, hopefully hopefully by next year at the latest. So this is going to be a fascinating area for us all to watch and pay attention to. Garry, I just want to say thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, whether we're on a sailboat over on the Chesapeake Bay or doing business together like this. And it's a pleasure to connect as often as we can. And I'm grateful for your generosity of heart that you would share this with me and with our viewers.
And Tom, just thank you for your continued leadership. I mean, obviously we've known each other for a long time, but you and your team, in terms of, you know, just supporting, you know, you're a central part of the equation in terms of helping companies really understand accreditation standards and be prepared. You know, without your company and your mission, you know, we wouldn't be having some of the successes we're having. And I just have the greatest admiration for you and Leslie and the rest of your team. So keep up the good work.
Thank you, Garry. And until we talk again, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.